Welcome. I'm Michael Krasny, and let me welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. It's a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews with national and international authors, journalists, tech and business experts, artists, scientists, entertainers, and opinion shapers. And you can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show. Then that's gray with an E. And you can stream us live at 11 a.m. Pacific time on Fridays when we include your questions and comments, and we do welcome them and invite them. We cover a wide range of intellectually engaging and timely, stimulating topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. And in this episode, we want to welcome Matt Abrahams, who's a communication expert and lecturer in organizational behavior in the Stanford Graduate School of Business. He's also the author of Speaking Up Without Speaking Out and Think Fast, Talk Smart, which is also the name of the over 1 million downloads a month podcast he hosts. He's a graduate of UC Davis and Stanford, and I welcome Matt to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to have you.
It's great to be here, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity to chat.
Delighted to chat with you. And I should say, by way of introduction, that the old figures used to be maybe 3 of 4 or even 80% of people have fears when it comes to public speaking. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association calls it an anxiety disorder or glossophobia. And the fact of the matter is that Matt has probably helped so many people that those numbers are down now, lower than the figures you frequently may see. And he would be wont to tell you, I think, that we're all hardwired by evolution for anxiety. It's necessary. And there are scientific methods, not necessarily to overcome it, but to really manage it and deal with it. That's what you've been all about, really, isn't it?
Absolutely. So when I first started doing the research I did, it was really around how to help people feel more comfortable and confident. And you're exactly right. It's hardwired into us. It's part of being human is to have a concern about speaking in front of others. But that doesn't preclude us from invoking several techniques that we can use to help ourselves feel more confident and calm in those moments of intense stress.
There are ways to really not only deal with those kind of problems and to manage them, as I said, but you really point out a lot of resources. One of the first things I think on your list is stop thinking about yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Many of us fixate on ourselves and we fixate on wanting to do it right. We want our communication to be right. And if we change the focus and focus on the value we bring to our audience and helping them, it totally changes the interaction and the way we feel about it. So simply reminding yourself that you have value to bring in the interaction, that you're in service of your audience and their needs, can help you tremendously. We often think of our audiences like the American Idol judges who are just looking to find fault in what we're doing. But in fact, in the vast majority of our communication, people want to derive value from what we're doing. And when we remind ourselves of that, we get out of our own head and we actually can focus on helping them.
Well, I actually, as you know, had a radio show for almost 30 years. And I used to tell people when they were nervous, think about this as just a conversation between the two of us. The two of us are talking and be at ease. I mean, which is, I found through the years was pretty good advice.
In fact, in graduate school, I did some work on that very technique, reframing your communication as a conversation. And when you do that, it helps you and it makes you other focused. It reminds you that it's about what you're co-creating with the person you're speaking on. And you can do this quite easily. One, just ask questions and answer questions. That is dialogic. That is a conversation. If you're doing a formal presentation, use questions in the presentation. Many people ask me, how do you outline a presentation? If you ever see one of my lectures, it's just a series of questions that I pose for myself to answer. And sometimes I'll say that. I'll say, today we're going to cover 3 questions. Question number 1. And I begin answering that question, and that forces me to be conversational. So being conversational is a great way to feel more comfortable when you communicate.
And you talk about having a map too. It's a good idea.
Absolutely. So I am a huge fan of structure. Structure provides a roadmap. Our brains are not wired for lists of information. In fact, I question you, Michael. How many items do you need to buy from the grocery store before you have to write it down? I mean, for me, it's 3. Otherwise, I'm going to forget something. And we're just not good at delineating and remembering lists. Having a structure, a logical connection, ideas, helps us and provides a map. I'll give you an example. Anyone who's seen a television ad has seen the structure play out. Problem, solution, benefit. An ad will tell you there's some issue, challenge in the world, their product or service helps resolve it, and then you benefit from it. That's a roadmap. And if I'm presenting or trying to persuade to you, I can use that same structure. And if I ever get lost or blank out or say, what comes next? I always know solution follows problem, benefit follows solution. So having a map builds that confidence. It's hard to get lost when you have a map.
You also say that people should maybe take the deep breaths that we're often told will help us and hold something cold, which is kind of a new idea to me, but also greet your anxiety. And I'm not sure that sounds a little woo-woo. I don't know what that means. Help me with that.
All right. Well, I'll go through all three of those very quickly. Taking deep breathing is perhaps the single best thing you can do to manage the physiological symptoms we have of anxiety. So if you've ever done yoga, tai chi, qigong, it's a deep belly breath. And the magic happens on the exhalation. So you want the exhale to be twice as long as your inhale. And just taking 2 or 3 deep breaths before you walk on stage, walk on the room, click join to the Zoom will help you. Many of us, when we get nervous, our heart beats faster and our body tenses up. So our blood pressure goes up. It's like you're exercising, and that causes us to sweat. It causes us to blush. So we need to cool ourselves down. The palms of your hand are thermoregulators for your body. On a cold morning, if you've ever held a warm cup of coffee or tea and feel that it warms you up, we can do the same thing in reverse by holding a cold bottle of water or any liquid. It brings our temperature down. My telltale sign when I get nervous is I blush and I perspire. So if I hold something cold, it actually reduces that heat and I blush and sweat less. And then that last one you mentioned, which is greeting our anxiety. Many of us get made more nervous by the anxiety signs that we begin to feel. So it goes something like this. I'm sitting in a meeting. I know I'm third on the agenda. Somebody, the first person speaks. I'm like, oh my goodness, my heart's beating faster. I feel the perspiration on my brow. Second person goes. I'm saying, oh, I should have prepared more. I'm not going to speak as well as they are. Do you see how that's spinning us up? We're getting more nervous because we're having these signs. Rather, if we just say, this is me getting nervous, it makes sense that I'm getting nervous. I'm doing something that's significant. It's important to me. By greeting the anxiety, we're invoking ideas that come from mindfulness, which says when you experience an emotion, positive or negative, greet it. And that buys you some time, a sense of agency where you can do something with it. By making it something you acknowledge that's almost outside of yourself, you can then have some more control over it.
And so much of this, in a seminal way, goes back to you having to give a karate talk at age 14.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. So as a freshman in high school, I grew up in the Bay Area. First day of my English class, Mr. Meredith had all of us stand up and say, what did you do this summer? Many of us have had that experience. I always sat front row near the door because my last name is Abraham, so I went first. After class, he came to me and said, you're good at this talking thing. You need to go to this speech tournament this coming Saturday. Every teacher had to send a student. And the only advice he said is, talk about something you're passionate about. So then, and still to this day, I'm into the martial arts. So I crafted a 10-minute speech on karate. When I showed up at 7:30 in the morning, this Saturday morning, barely awake, in my pants that were too short because I'd grown over the summer, my father had helped tie my tie. I was so nervous because my friends were there. Their parents were judges for this event. The girl I liked was in the room. I forgot to put on my karate pants. So I was wearing my normal pants, and you can see where this is going. The first 10 seconds of this 10-minute speech, I started with a karate kick to get everybody's attention. I ripped my pants from zipper to belt buckle in the back. Horrific experience. It taught me that anxiety can really impact your communication. And it's from that moment that I think my interest in managing anxiety started.
But I'm interested in what Mr. Meredith told you. You're good at this talking thing. I mean, it's a great story. It's a seminal story. But I kind of focus on that for a moment because I was always told that I was really very able at speaking publicly and giving lectures and so forth and so on. And there were so many things that I felt almost the opposite as far as my abilities. But it was something that came natural. It was, it's a gift, and thank you wherever it came from. You can make the argument, I wonder if you've heard this argument, to what extent you counter it, that some people are just more gifted that way than others. It's like I taught composition for years, and you could bring people up in their level and ability to write, but there are so many people who just don't have the ability, and some people just naturally write because they're gifted at it, able.
So certainly people start in different places. It has to do, I believe, with temperament in terms of your personality, what you're born with. I think particularly your environment influences it. I can trace my ability, if I have any, to my parents. My mother was an elementary school teacher. Communication was important. Being engaging was important. My father was a lawyer, being very structured and logical and careful with the wording you use. So environment and genetics, I think, certainly play a function. But, like you, we wouldn't go into teaching and focusing on helping people if we didn't think it was a skill that you could develop. And I think we would both agree that the ability to communicate has tremendous impact over your lives and the relationships you have. So yes, I do think people start at different levels based on who they are and their environments, but all of us can learn to improve.
And we are going to be taking your questions. Here's one from Bill in Morgantown, West Virginia. He says, one of the things I've begun to do is lecture less and answer more. How do you approach Q&A in talks?
Wonderful. I think Q&A is fantastic. I think anything that makes conversation is really important. So I encourage people to ask questions. I allow for time for questions to come in. I set people's expectations that I'd like their questions. And in fact, if I call for questions and questions don't come in, I will ask myself a question. I'll say something like, last time I talked about this, people were wondering, or a common question I get is. So I really appreciate that idea that getting questions and dialogue going is really important. And we need to be responsive in a positive way, not just saying, great question, good question. That actually drives me nuts where every question somebody says, good question.
They usually say that if you talk about something in their strengths.
Exactly, because I think what they mean is good, I know the answer. Yeah. But you really, engage with the person, follow up to make sure that you answered the question, because that's where the real connection happens. The origin of the word communicate comes from to make common, which means it's about connection. It's about fidelity. It's about understanding. And Q&A is a great tool to help us get to that.
You provide some tools for so many things, including if you have a faux pas that you have uttered. How do you correct and rectify that? What do you suggest?
So a couple of things I'll talk about. One is just our mindset around making mistakes. Many of us, as I alluded to earlier, want to do our communication right. And I am here to tell you, after decades of doing this work, there is no right way to communicate. There's certainly better ways and worse ways, but we put a tremendous amount of pressure on ourselves to do it right. And I like to tell my students, it's about connection, not perfection. If you can get your point across, then you've been successful. It's not saying it exactly the right way each time. So getting that mindset shift can be really helpful. And I encourage my students to look at mistakes as missed takes. In television and movie production, they do multiple takes of a scene. Not that any one scene is wrong or bad, but it's just a different way of doing it. So when something doesn't go well, just remind yourself, okay, we're just going to take another take. Maybe I tell a different story, or I use different wording and repeat myself. If you make a mistake, often just move on, just keep going. Many people might not even notice it. We have in our heads an expectation of how we wanted to say it. The audience doesn't know what you intended to say or how you intended to say it. So if you don't say it that way, they don't know. So often with a faux pas, you can simply just keep going. Now, if it's a clear error, you mispronounce something, you leave something out, I simply recommend going back and correcting without making a big deal out of it. Like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot that. We don't want to highlight and focus the audience's attention on the faux pas. Rather, we want them to focus on the messaging. It's similar to when people start a presentation, say, I'm so nervous, because they're hoping to get empathy. But all you're doing is training the audience to fixate on everything you do that demonstrates you're nervous. So depending on the degree of the faux pas, just ride through it or correct it without drawing a lot of attention to it.
That's good advice generally. In a book I'm doing, which you're familiar with to some degree, which has to do with interviewing and conversation, I talk about an interview I did a number of years ago with Patti Smith, and I asked her a question that she felt she didn't want to be asked. She did a book about her relationship with Mapplethorpe, the artist, and talked about her having a child out of wedlock and giving it up for adoption. And I said, well, do you have any contact with the child? And she said, it's none of your damn business. Just move on, There's no, I mean, in some instances, you want to maybe use that as clickbait, but the best advice I can give people is just move on through it. And here's some advice you might be able to offer Chris, who's joining us from Sarasota, Florida. And thanks for this question, Chris. He says, how about hecklers? Have you had anyone heckle or interrupt you while you were talking? And if so, how'd you handle it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And but going back to your idea of just moving on, basketball coach Mike Krzyzewski taught all of his players this wonderful tool, which is next play. If you are ruminating, if you're sitting there living in the past, your team is down the court trying to defend one person down. Next play is a great way to approach communication. Not that you don't reflect later, but in the moment, just move on.
Well, I could have said to Patty Smith, didn't you write about this? And what?
Yeah.
And it turned out she was angry because Terry Gross had pushed her on this, which I didn't know, and she apologized afterward. But that's
right.
That's just the coda.
Yeah, but you moved on. So hecklers. I mean, heckling can come in lots of different varieties. For the most recent book I wrote, which is all about what I call spontaneous speaking, think faster, talk smarter, I interviewed a stand-up comedian, and he actually shared that he embraces the heckling. So rather than see it as a threat or a challenge, he sees it as an opportunity to connect, to learn, to extend and expand. And I think that's true for all of us. It's how we see it. If somebody interrupts you with a challenging question or a different point of view, you can get defensive and really retreat, or you can embrace it and try to learn from it and actually connect to it. And that can be really helpful. Now, obviously, it has to be polite. It has to be respectful, not offensive to people. When somebody heckles, if that happens, you have to stop that. But you can look at it as a gift, as an opportunity. You know, in the world of improv, one of the foundational principles is yes and. And when somebody engages you, be it heckling or proposing something counter to your point of view, there's something there that you can mine and explore. And if you're open to that, really good things happen. This comedian, his name is Trevor Wallace, that I interviewed. He's got quite a following. He says some of his best material comes as a result of that interaction when the heckler states something.
Well, that's where you can be spontaneous and think fast.
Yeah,
and
exactly. And hopefully talk smart. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I see your book back there, and let's talk a little bit. Those two things don't always go together. Sometimes you think fast and you get sloppy in your thinking, or you talk stupid in your thinking.
Yes, absolutely. So when I talk about thinking faster or think fast, it's really about pattern recognition. You know, people who are expert at what they do are very good at recognizing patterns. Athletes, musicians. It's really about seeing the pattern and then helping yourself get to that structure or roadmap that I talked about more quickly. And just like an athlete does a lot of agility drills, so when they're in the game, they can be more agile, we can do the same as we want to hone and develop our spontaneous speaking skills. And if we develop those skills, we will be able to think faster, recognize the patterns or the directions we can go. And then by leveraging structure, we can then talk in a way that's more concise and clear. And that's the talking smarter piece.
How valuable is it, since you mentioned athletes and the like, to think of what you're doing when you're talking as a performance? Or how valuable is it to think of as a job? I got to get the job done, like a bricklayer almost, or something along those lines.
How we frame things, the metaphors we use are really important. I have a colleague at Stanford Business School. Her name's Michelle Gelfand, and she does a lot of research on the analogies and metaphors we use around conflict and negotiation. Am I going to battle? Am I playing a game? Is it a dance? And all of that definitely influences the way we approach it. I am not a big fan of seeing communication as a performance, because I think that sets you up for performance anxiety. There's a right way. Performers like to do it the right way. So I'm not a big fan of that particular framing. I'm not opposed to seeing it as a job, because a job means you work, you prepare, you build things up. But whatever helps people to get them motivated and focused, I think is a good thing. But it's important for us to realize that the metaphors and analogies we use to frame our interactions influence not only how we approach it, but the words we use and the connection that we have.
I finally came to think of this, what I do and what we're doing now is a kind of a dialogue dance. It has all the earmarks of, and then you think about all the different dances that you can engage in and engender. There's also that feeling that the energy has to be high and you have to be in the moment.
Yeah.
I mean, these are certainly tips that anybody who wants to be a really effective speaker can cling to tenaciously, because they work.
Absolutely. In communication, sometimes the most important thing you can do, though, is just pause and wait a minute. You are expert at this. I love it when you interview people and you'll give just a little beat of a pause, and then somebody actually extends more. There's a wonderful mantra in improv that says, don't just do something, stand there. And I love that idea that in that moment, the most important thing you could do is just pause, listen, allow for space from the other person. And in good dancing, there's that way. You're switching roles. Who's being more directive? Who's being less directive? It's really an apt analogy for what we're doing right now.
And when we're talking about communication per se, listening is much more important than most people realize. I mean, people come to me and they say, how can I be a good talk show host? How can I be a good interviewer? And I said, one of the things you have to do is listen, and listen intently and actively.
Yeah.
Be there.
Absolutely. Listening is critical. And we often, as you said, take it for granted. Most of us are very poor listeners. We listen only for the top line, and then we begin judging, rehearsing, preparing for what we want to say. I have a colleague who joked, listening is that thing I have to do before I get my turn to speak. And it's, in fact, listening is a huge gift and a huge opportunity. When I teach listening, I teach people to listen for the bottom line. And I say the best way to do it is to listen as if you have to paraphrase. Because when you listen to paraphrase, to get to the crux of what somebody is saying, you listen much more intently. And in my book, I borrow from another colleague of mine, Collins Dobbs, this approach he has to critical, crucial conversations. He says it's all about pace, space, and grace. And I think we can take those three elements and apply it to listening. You have to slow down. Life moves very quickly. And if I slow down, I can listen better. So I have to slow the pace down. I have to give myself space, not just physical space. You know, as I get older, all these spaces get louder, but mental space. I have to clear the decks in my mind to really focus. And then you have to give yourself grace, permission, not just to listen to what is being said, but what's not being said, where it's being said, how it's being said, because all of that can influence how you respond. I'll give you a quick example. Imagine, Michael, you and I come out of a meeting and you say, Matt, how do you think that went? And I immediately at the top line say, oh, you want feedback. And I itemize all the things that went wrong or could have gone better. But had I noticed, you came out the back door, not the front door. You were looking down and speaking a little more quietly. What you really wanted in that moment was not feedback, but support. And because I was not listening intently, I missed that opportunity and might have damaged our relationship.
You're looking for nuance. You're looking for maybe what isn't so evident or isn't so conspicuous. And you're hearing things that are maybe below a different threshold as much as you possibly can. I mean, I think this is all really valuable advice and good wisdom that we're offering here. I'm just wondering to what extent things come in like, I have a concept I call riff ready, certain kind of interviews and conversations where you've got material, sometimes just humor, you know, or a good joke or something along those lines. I did a whole book on humor. If you have those things at the ready, they can be very useful in any kind of conversation, any dialogue.
Absolutely. I am not adverse at all to stockpiling. Just like an athlete, practices certain moves for certain situations, stockpiling, I think, is a good idea. And I think we can stockpile anecdotes and stories, testimonials, the goal being that if they fit into the context, we can pull them in. It's one way to look at structure is it's a recipe. And most good chefs will prepare the ingredients in advance. And when the recipe calls for it, they just pull those ingredients in. So if you stockpile a few good examples, a few ideas, it's helpful. Now, you have to have the right attitude. It's not, I'm going to tell this joke in this interview. It's, I have this joke I can use if the opportunity presents itself.
Is there a danger, though, or a peril in that you keep falling back on it maybe time after time and doesn't quite have the punch or the vitality?
Certainly, of course. You don't want to be a one-trick pony having multiple types of support. I coach people who interview, as you can imagine, teaching at a business school, to stockpile lots of different examples for different themes that you want to get across. So when somebody asks you a question, you first, this is the pattern recognition, say, that question is related to this theme. I know I have 3 or 4 things stockpiled. Which one of those in this instance makes the most sense? So I'm not always leaning on the same example, the same anecdote. I have a small set of them that I can pull in as it makes sense.
In communication in general, though, how important is establishing rapport and trust and those kinds of things? Because if you can do it, you have to do it pretty quickly, and you have to establish it in an ephemeral way that doesn't necessarily have a long-lasting quality or enduring quality to it.
Certainly having rapport and building trust is really important for most communication. I mean, some communication is just quite transactional, but when it is important, we need to spend the time thinking about how to do it. Now, what many people don't remind themselves of is that you can do it way before the interaction actually happens. I'll give you an example. I think one of the most underutilized tool for establishing rapport is a calendar invite. We just slap a name on the meeting, we just slap a URL, and we just send it out. We can do a lot about expectation setting, rapport building, in how we structure the meeting invite. So there's a lot of work you can do in advance of the interaction to help yourself build that rapport. But coming in with curiosity, coming in with empathy, listening, those are great ways to build rapport. My mother-in-law had a black belt in trust building, friendship making. And she did it with 3 simple words: tell me more. So when somebody would say something, she would follow up. She'd pause for a beat, and then she would say, tell me more. And just giving somebody permission and to signal that I'm really interested help build that trust and rapport.
We just had a podcast last week with Kelly Corrigan, who has a TV show on PBS called Tell Me More. And
yeah, exactly.
Also has a book under that title too. But you mentioned, I want to go to another question in a moment, but you mentioned curiosity, and I had occasion to have have lunch with a famous author who I admire, Amor Towles, and he said that he wanted to have lunch with me largely to get ideas from me about interviewing. Like I said, I've got this book underway, so I had some things to share with him. And Malcolm Gladwell, who I'm about to interview fairly soon, used to say, if something comes off the top of your head immediately, trust it. It's your unconscious operating in ways that you may not even be able to divine. And the first thing that came to my mind, sitting there with Malcolm Gladwell, was trust your curiosity. Mm-hmm. I said that to him, and he said, boy, that's a good name for a chapter in your book. So it's become a chapter in the book.
Oh, I love it.
But I do trust my curiosity. And, some people perhaps may not trust their curiosity. I'm curious. I'm talking to you, and I'm curious about all this work that you've done, and I've done some preparation, obviously. I've looked into your background and so forth, which is key and important to any interview, as I point out, as much as listening. But there's a real importance in just being curious.
Absolutely. It to me, again, it's a mindset. I believe that everybody has some value to provide, and I'm always curious as to that value and what it is that people find important and trying to connect to it. I think the interviewers that I have been interviewed by, or the ones that I know, have that in common. There's this notion of curiosity and the ability to connect what they're hearing to larger ideas or previous notions. And that, I think, those two, curiosity and the ability to connect, I think are really important. I'm very much looking forward to reading your book, but I'm also curious about the advice you give people about how to be curious, because for some, I think it comes more naturally than others.
My mother used to say curiosity killed the cat, but satisfaction brought it back. There is a certain method, at least, of massaging your curiosity or bringing it to, which prompts me to ask another question, and then we'll go to questions that are coming in to us from others. What do you think about using ChatGPT for questions, or AI for questions, if you're doing any kind of an interview or whatever? Yeah. I avoid it. I don't want this robotic thing to invade me, but maybe that's just me.
No, I think that represents a lot of people. I mean, I am by nature optimistic about life, and I think AI has a role to play in our communication. I think there are many concerns to have about it. In my classroom, I'll tell you that I encourage my students, when they're preparing for spontaneous speaking, we do several activities in class, I'll say use AI to help generate some practice questions for you. It's a way of getting reps and practice. So I think there are some uses for it. I admit I've used AI to help me in doing the research I do for my Think Fast, Talk Smart podcast, where I will just get some background information or get some synthesis. Some of the people I've interviewed have written many, many books, and I'll ask it to find common threads among the books that I won't be able to read all 7 books in the amount of time I have. So there are ways, I think, to leverage it to help deepen what you're curious about, but obviously there's some skepticism, I believe, that should go with the results. So I am optimistic, and yet have not come to a full conclusion. The one thing I'll share with you, and on my show, I interviewed 2 people who did some research on this, and what they have found is you can get better results out of these LLMs and artificial intelligence by being more conversational with it. Many of us treat our queries of AI as if it's just a search engine and we just put in search queries. When in fact, if you have a dialogue with it and take what it says and then comment on it and ask for more information, you end up getting deeper, richer information. So something to think about, Michael, as somebody who studies communication as you have, that what makes you more effective with AI is actually enhancing and honing your communication. I find that very rewarding and to some extent relieving. There's some relief in that.
We're going to be treating it more human, in other words. Then we get Scarlett Johansson into this whole deal.
Well, that's a whole different story, isn't it?
Well, we've got questions for you. Let me go to them. Susan in Boise, Idaho says, how do you pace your talk to manage the audience energy in real time? I often have stories and jokes that I'll use if I see the audience blinking too much. Thank you, Susan.
So I think awareness, what I love about that question, Susan, is that you're aware. So many people see communication as broadcasting. Like I have to get from A to Z regardless of what's happening in front of me. I love the fact that you're actually noticing that the audience is blinking or looking disengaged. So part of it is awareness. Part of it is understanding that there are things you can do to re-engage your audience. First and foremost, it's all about being salient and relevant. You have to make sure what you're saying is meaningful to the audience. And sometimes you have to build that meaning for them. You have to help them see it. But if we don't connect to meaning for the audience, there's no incentive for them to pay attention. I believe the most precious commodity we have in the world today is attention. And it's actually relatively easy to get people's attention. It's sustaining that attention. And that's what I call engagement. That's really hard. And there's some things you can do. There's physical activities. Have people take a poll. If you're virtual, typing into the chat, turn to each other and talk. There are cognitive engagement techniques, asking questions, using analogies. Humor fits in that category. And then there are linguistic ways to engage people, using people's names, using what I call time-traveling language, saying things like, picture this, or imagine what it would be like if. When you use that language, people actually see it in their mind, so they're engaged. So first you have to notice if people are engaged or not. Second, you have to make sure your content is relevant and salient. And third, leverage physical, cognitive, and linguistic engagement tools to keep them with you.
You can also engage through clickbait too, I'm sorry to say, right?
Well, clickbait, I would argue, gets attention. I don't know that it sustains that attention.
It doesn't sustain necessarily.
Right, and that's where you need to follow it up because people will feel tricked, right? I always use this example in class. I say, take a poll. That's really useful. Well, here's how some of my students execute the poll. They'll say, raise your hand if you've ever blanked, and everybody raises their hand. They don't comment on the results, and they just start talking afterwards. Well, that's clickbait. People are like, you made me raise my hand. You don't respond at all. So you actually have to engage after you get the intention. You have to say, that's what I thought. Half of you in the room experienced that. Or, whoa, I'm surprised. Everybody has. So there is a difference between attention getting and engagement.
There's Becky from San Jose who says, do you have advice on effectively communicating during a job interview?
I have a lot to say about job interviewing, yes.
I figured you did, yeah.
I recently partnered with LinkedIn and we did a 2-part podcast where one of their folks, Andrew Seaman, was on my podcast and I was on his, and it was all about interviewing skills. So several things. First and foremost, as Michael alluded to, do your research. You need to know the company, cyber stalk them, look up the people you're interviewing with, understand their mission, vision, values. Then think, how do I bring value? What are the themes I want to get across to demonstrate my value? And as I mentioned earlier, stockpile some examples, testimonials from former bosses, awards you've won, stories of success or challenges you've had, data that represent things that you've done. Maybe you've increased efficiency by a certain percentage. And then when you get the questions, mix and match. Say to yourself, that's about this theme. Here's what I'm going to pull in. And then I have a structure that I really like for answering questions. Again, I'm a big fan of structure. It's called ADD, for adding value. Answer the question, give a detailed example, and then describe the relevance of your answer. I have tried in my answers to Michael's questions to demonstrate this. So I give an answer, I then try to give an example, and then I try to explain how that answer could be applicable to others. It doesn't sound as formulaic as you might hear me describing it. When you do it, it just sounds like a complete answer. We often think that if I just answer it, people will be able to connect the dots. but people aren't so good at dot connecting. One of my first psychology professors when I was an undergrad had this saying. He said, the funny thing about common sense is it's not so common. We assume people will connect the dots and they don't. So by answering the question, giving an example that you've previously stockpiled, and then explaining what it means in this case in terms of the job can be really useful.
Well, let me ask you a question, and you can apply the structure in your response.
Please. Excellent.
From your TED Talk, you say, make stress your friend. What do you mean by that? I mean, how does that work out in terms of a solution?
Many of us feel alienated by our stress. We feel like it puts us distant from our audience, and it puts us focused on ourselves. By making stress your friend, you can actually leverage the benefits of stress. That's my answer. By leveraging the benefit of stress, you actually remind yourself that what you're saying is important. You remind yourself that there's value in it because it's high stakes, and it forces you to think about the best way to communicate that point. That's my example. So when the next time you have to speak and you begin to feel that stress, remind yourself that the stress is actually there to help you so you can be better focused. That's my application piece. So that's answer, example, and how you can put it into practice.
Good advice and well handled. And here's Peter from Tucson who wants to know, what should people consider when creating a slide deck? How do you avoid death by PowerPoint?
Thank you for that question. So I know how most people create planned presentations. They beg, borrow, and steal every slide they and others have created, and they create what I call a Franken deck. You know how Frankenstein was an amalgamation of body parts. People just slam different slides together from different places. And then when they deliver it, they're like, that didn't flow well. People didn't understand it. It never could have. I believe slides can be very useful for communication, but they are in service of your story. They're in service of the information you're trying to get across. So I have 4 rules I try to encourage my students and anybody who will listen to take on. Rule number 1, story first, slide second. No more Frankendecks. Second, slides are for your audience, not for you. Many of us create slides as teleprompters for ourselves. Ask yourself, would a slide help my audience to understand better what I'm saying? Does it simplify, amplify, or clarify something? If it does one of those 3 things, think about having a slide. If it doesn't, don't include one. You do not need a slide for everything you say. Point 3, or advice number 3, less is more. The less information you put on a slide, the more value it will bring. You should be asking yourself, what's the least amount of information I can put on this slide to be meaningful? We have this notion in our society that number of slides matters in some way. It does not. I am always asked, I'm speaking for 10 minutes. How many slides should I have? My answer is enough and not too many. There's no specific correlation between time of speaking and number of slides. And then the 4th point is visual over verbal. If there's a way to communicate the information visually, a chart, a flow diagram, a picture, versus bullet points in words. When I put a lot of words or bullet points on my slide, I'm overtaxing the verbal part of my brain. I'm asking you to listen to what I'm saying and read what I've put up there at the same time. We're not good at that multitasking. So 4 bits of guidance: story first, slide second, slides are for your audience, less is more, and visual over verbal when it makes sense.
It's all very useful, and all coming from the research and teaching that you've done all these many years. A tribute to you. How much do you think about your audience when you're giving like a PowerPoint or any kind of presentation, as opposed to, I've got this material, I want to get through it, I want to follow my map, I want to get my mindset right, all of those kinds of things. My energy has to be high. I want to be in the moment, all those kinds of things that we've been talking about and alluding to, as opposed to, I have to think of the audience.
Thinking about your audience, being audience-centric, is the North Star of communication, bar none. In all the episodes I've done, my podcast is all about communication. I interviewed many communication experts. The number 1 bit of advice is, although said differently in many different ways, is know your audience, be in service of your audience, be audience-centric. The purpose of communication is to make common, to connect, and we have to think about our audience first. Now, all those other things you talked about are also important. Be focused, have good energy, make sure that you are structured in what you say. But it's all predicated on tailoring the material to the needs of your audience. If we don't make it salient and relevant, if we don't articulate it in a way that can be heard, it's for naught. We all suffer from the curse of knowledge and the curse of passion. We know too much about what we speak and we care too much about it. And because of that, we can use jargon and get too deep too quickly. You have to think about your audience. You have to think about what's relevant and important to them.
I still think some of the best advice, shows my literary background, I suppose, came from Horace, the Roman poet, who said,
Yes.
the purpose of literature is to please and to instruct. And you can say the same thing about most communication. Please or delight, entertain, and teach, instruct, go together.
Absolutely. And Michael, I always love the references that you bring. I have not read Horace recently, but I appreciate what you've said.
You could read Horace in the original Latin. My hat goes off to you. I can't either.
I certainly cannot.
There's Thomas from Atlanta who says, what is a good way to provide positive emotional connection in a world where remote connections are becoming the norm? Thank you for that, Thomas. Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. Connecting is really important. Sometimes it's put down the phone and reach out to the person, maybe picking it up and actually calling. I have two children, late teens, and they don't use their phones for actually speaking. And so reaching out and making that connection, demonstrating that you are there to support somebody. I think one of the most valuable skills is paraphrasing. I said it's a great tool to help you listen better. But when I paraphrase what you've said, and that's not like what a 5-year-old does where you parrot back word for word, but where you highlight the key essence of what you've taken away, it is a wonderful way to say, I've listened, I understand. Doesn't mean you agree, but I understand what you've said. And that's a great way to connect. And we are often so busy or using technology that doesn't allow for that. When you're texting, it's very hard to paraphrase. A thumbs up emoji is not the same thing as me repeating what I heard you say in a way that was meaningful to me. So we have to go the extra effort, but it is well worth it when you do so.
Yeah, paraphrasing is a valuable tool, especially to show that you really are listening and you're hearing and taking it in. I'm wondering, though, when you talk about paraphrasing as a tool, you're also talking, I think, in some of your writing and speeches about visualization as a tool.
Absolutely.
A lot of people think visualization, does that really... I remember when I first interviewed Shakti Gawain, who had written, what some considered almost a seminal book on visualization. I thought, if it really worked, I would have been an outstanding basketball player because I was visualizing myself doing remarkable things with a basketball, on the court. And it was probably, as competitive sports go, it was probably my worst sport. I actually shot at the wrong basket one time in a tryout.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah. True story.
Yeah, got to reverse that visualization. I too would have been a much better basketball player than I am. So I believe visualization is a very useful technique to desensitize ourselves. One of the earliest techniques used to study anxiety management techniques was this notion of visualization. It's not in the sense that you're talking about in terms of manifestation. It is simply a way of desensitizing you. So you actually have seen it before. Think of it more as a simulator. Pilots go through lots of hours of flight simulators before they actually fly so they can be calmer. Visualization allows you the same thing. And now technology is actually out there that you can do it through VR, virtual reality. There are several tools. One I really like called Virtual Speech, where you run their app on your phone and then you actually plug it into goggles and you can set up the size of the audience, the venue you're speaking in. You can even specify is the audience hostile or friendly so that you practice in that mode. It's like having the defense when you're practicing your offense on the field so that you're used to it. When you get into that experience, you've been there before. So visualization actually works really well as a way of desensitizing yourself. You can do it simply by closing your eyes or leveraging a tool to help you. But I'm going to leave to the other gurus out there to talk about manifesting things in your life. What I will say is there's pretty solid academic research that visualization desensitizes you to the anxiety and potential negative outcomes that can happen.
And I confess I haven't seen much research that validates manifestations, but we won't necessarily go there.
Right.
Let's go instead to Andrew, who is joining us from Oakland. Thank you for this question, Andrew. He says, how do you communicate effectively with people that you don't like or that you're in conflict with?
Yeah. What a very appropriate question for the world we live in today. Yes. So fundamental to communication is connection. So trying to find some place of connection. I am often asked, because this is a big fear many people have, is what do I do when somebody really lobs an objection my way or a personal attack? And one way I'd like to address it is just to reframe it as at least the person cares, right? I think what's much harder to deal with is somebody who's apathetic and non-responsive. I would much rather take somebody who's hostile to my point of view than somebody who's apathetic. But trying to find a place of connection, listening to understand, again, understanding and agreement are different, and giving the person space to be heard. Doesn't mean you agree. But if we can get to that point where we listen and in return and some reciprocity, they'll listen to you, I think that's a good start. I also, again, I'm a big believer in mindset. When you approach situations where you think there might be some conflict, rather than hunkering down and putting on the armor, open up a little bit and say, is there an opportunity here for me to learn? Is there a way that there could be some connection that I find? And by being open to that, you might find avenues that you would more typically close yourself off to.
I'm often asked, what about people who just go on, like logorrhea or garrulousness that has no end to it? And there's no easy answer to that, but sometimes you just have to be firm and assertive, and that's the only answer, really.
So I don't want to repeat myself too much, but paraphrasing is a Swiss Army knife for communication, and it is an amazing tool for dealing with the over-talker. For whatever reason, maybe they're confused and they're trying to figure out their point. Maybe they're coming at you to show how smart they are. In those moments, paraphrasing can shut them down with respect. So if you were talking too much, Michael, which I don't think would happen, I might interrupt you with highlighting something important. You say, I might say, that point about curiosity is really fascinating. In fact, I acknowledge something of value you provided. I am then taking the floor away from you in the most polite way I know. In an environment where there are others around, if you let the person go on and on and on, you're actually losing your credibility in front of the other people. Yet we feel very rude doing what I just described. You're actually being rude to all of the others who are not going to step in and tell the person to shut up. So paraphrasing, I think, is the most polite way to silence somebody and then move forward with your agenda or to the next point.
Are you sure my curiosity story wasn't too long and you're just being nice now?
Well, you bring up a really important, I thought your curiosity story was appropriate length, but the notion of being concise is critical. Many of us say much more than we need to. You shared a few moments ago advice your mother gave you. My mother gave me advice, which is tell the time, don't build the clock. And many of us are clock builders when we communicate. We have to be concise and clear, especially in this age where there's so much information out there. How do you be concise and clear? You make sure what you're saying is relevant to your audience. You use a structure and you have a goal. I believe all communication must be goal-driven. A goal has three parts: information, emotion, and action. What do I want my audience to know? How do I want them to feel? And what do I want them to do? By thinking about your goal that's relevant to the audience you're speaking to, it will help you be more clear and concise.
Stories also are extremely valuable. And you tell a story, and I'd like you to tell the story about a woman named Irma, which is really a very poignant story and has all kinds of resonance to it.
Librarian, and her granddaughter was getting married. She was very proud of her granddaughter. She had a very special connection with her granddaughter. And her granddaughter had asked her to speak at her wedding. And Irma, unfortunately, as a young girl, had a very traumatic experience speaking. She was in her class. She was giving a speech of some sort. And at the end, and I cannot, as a teacher, and Michael, I'm sure as a teacher yourself, I just cannot imagine somebody saying this, but the teacher looked at her and said, "That is the absolute worst speech I have ever heard. You should never speak in this class again." And it was devastating to her, so much so that the reason she became a research librarian was so she wouldn't have to speak in front of others in that way. So she had a very specific event that really initiated her anxiety around speaking. And yet she wanted to give this gift to her granddaughter, a very poignant speech as part of the wedding. So she came to me to offer some coaching to help her. We worked very hard. She actually worked. She did all the heavy lifting, and she was able to give that speech, and it went very well. And she was in her 70s when this happened, and she was so proud of herself. But more so, she was so proud of being able to give the gift to her granddaughter. And I use that story for several reasons. One, to show that early experiences can really impact how we communicate and what we do, but also to show that with tenacity and with clear purpose, we can all learn to improve our communication and manage the anxiety that we have.
And here's Gerald from Plano, Texas, who says, thank you for the question, Gerald. When we're talking to someone and we don't agree with them, should we focus less on persuading them and more on simply understanding them and their understanding us?
I think that's good advice. And I think that the research bears that out, that if the ultimate goal is influence, you need to start with understanding and finding that common ground or common concern. To just bring in the influence, bring in the persuasion will often make the other person more rigid in their stance and less open. So I think get the information, get the understanding, and then think about how best to try to move the person along. I'll share that a lot of research that shows changing people, helping people change to your point of view when they're entrenched in theirs. Some of the best things you can do is to get them to help you along the way. So inquiry is a much better way than dogmatically coming in and saying, here's what you should believe. Asking questions such as, what led you to hold that position? Or a great question that's been shown to work in research is, what would it take to change you away from that position? So you actually get the person you're trying to convince to come up with the arguments themselves. So figuring out their position, asking questions, looking for understanding, absolutely the first steps in influence when somebody's entrenched.
It's so often difficult, though, to overcome the chasm that exists. I mean, I'm not talking about all the polarization in the world we live in now, but thinking about referencing something that you brought up earlier. I think it was called a duologue. Somebody's talking and they want to say what they have to say, and they'll maybe let the person talk, but they really want to get back to more what they want to say. And this is how a lot of people communicate, frankly.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we have to reframe what the purpose of communication, and we have to understand that we have to think to ourselves, what is success? Many of us, when dealing with the parent-child relationship, I think is a good example of this, where I just want my child to do this, and success is only if they do that thing. Having a better appreciation of there's some distance that we have to walk together before we can get there. And success might be that we actually were able to complete the conversation without one of us storming out of the room. That might be where we start. So it's about incrementalism rather than just fixating on the goal.
There's also a lot of psychology involved in what we're talking about. I mean, letting the person know that you recognize the importance of what or just really giving the proper amount of attention and saying things that show that you're connecting to the content.
Absolutely. Understanding and appreciating others is paramount in communication, and the field of communication itself is very closely aligned with psychology. Social psychology and a lot of interpersonal communication are in some ways identical in terms of what they look at and how they look at it, and it's very important. And my studies started in psychology and graduated into communication. So they're intimately related.
Well, from all the work you've done, and it's real interdisciplinary work to come to the kind of understanding of communication with the depth that you have, what do you tell people when they just tell you they lack confidence? How do they find greater confidence? Some wisdom on that?
I hope there's you tell me if it's wisdom or not. So often what somebody is saying, I think, when they say I don't have confidence is they are looking inward versus outward. And so I will often ask people to share with me a time where they had some success communicating and helping others, and to encourage them to look at what they did or how they did it. I also love using analogies. So if I work with somebody who says that, I'll often say, have you ever played sports before, or a musical instrument before? And really help them find that they do have a confidence, but what they're doing is comparing themselves to either others or this lofty goal that they have for themselves, and that puts them at a disadvantage. And so part of it is just trying to get them to redefine what confidence is and how it could look for them. And in so doing, they begin to feel empowered and they're willing to initiate. Saying I don't have confidence in some ways can be an excuse, and really helping people fight through that can be very, very helpful.
Here's Tom from Pittsburgh, who says, as most corporate jobs require very few papers but lean heavily on decks and demos, should K-12 schools spend more time preparing our kids to present?
I actually think they are already. I marvel. I have a young nephew, and I marvel at what his teachers are asking him to do in terms of presenting, collaborative group work. He's created slide decks already. I wonder if when he enters the workforce, if there'll be a job for someone who does what I do. So I do think there is effort in that direction, and I think it is important. And I think it's important not just domestically here in the United States, but there are several countries who are really fixated on writing, and writing is important, absolutely. But the ability to speak and to communicate in groups and teams is also important. So I do think we need to continue to lean into that and really help kids as they grow up understand the value of oral communication and collaborative work.
Do you have any other ideas about how that can be enhanced at earlier phases of education?
So I think role models, parents, guardians can be demonstrating and showing children how they do that in their work. I often will share some big presentations I have or big meetings I have with my family, not just to get their input, but hopefully to role model for my kids that this is something that you do in the real world. So I think there's some of that. I think partnerships with businesses and organizations can be really helpful, where they come in and say, this is how we use these skills. I, as a teacher, always try to bring in outside experts who can reinforce the ideas that I try to teach my students. So it is through those partnerships and role modeling that I think we can get that information across. And hey, if you've got a kid in a school, go to the teacher and say, thank you so much for spending time getting my kid up in front of the class speaking or using group work in class, because teachers need that feedback too. A lot of teachers live in their classrooms, and helping them see that what they're teaching your kids is valuable, I think, can really help.
Kevin from Nashville wants to know, what software do you use for your slide decks? A practical question. Yeah.
I am multilingual, as it were. So I use everything from Keynote to PowerPoint to Google Slides. I'm a big fan of Prezi. I think Prezi is a cool tool to do things, and there are a whole bunch of tools that can help make it easier for you, Canva and other things. So I'm multilingual. I am not wedded to any particular tool, just like I'm not wedded to any particular virtual tool like Zoom, Teams, Meet, WebEx. I think we all have to be multilingual.
Any advice for the podcasters? I mean, you have a very successful podcast.
Well, thank
you.
A
lot of that is the content. A lot of that is you, I'm sure. So once you get past those two obvious kinds of things, what would you hold forth on?
Well, thank you. Coming from you, Michael, it is a true compliment. I very much value that. I grew up listening to you and really learned a lot from your interviewing style. I think being curious is really important. What has helped us is to have a very specific focus. We focus on communication and careers. And so having a clear focus and always reminding yourself that you're in service of the audience. What would the audience want to know? We go to great lengths to get input from our audience, to respond to questions and queries. I see myself as a tour guide almost through the material. And I want to make sure that the destination the tour is going on is where people want to end up. So it's about focus. It's about connecting and really getting feedback. And like we've talked about, being genuinely curious and willing to ask questions.
Well, you've helped a lot of people, and you have much to be proud of. I'm just going to conclude with one question here from John in Reno, Nevada. It says, a recent study showed that telling jokes while public speaking is seen as positive for men and detrimental for women. Do you give different advice to speakers depending on their demographics? I thought he was going to say depending on their gender, but he says depending on their demographics.
Well, right. So, culture and context significantly influence communication, and culture can be place of origin, could be age, and we just have to be sensitive to it. There are certainly biases that people bring to communication, and we have to be aware of those and think about it. But at the same time, we still need to try to push the envelope on things. And I think, two of my colleagues, Jennifer Acker and Naomi Bagdonis, wrote an amazing book on humor in the workplace. They themselves are incredibly funny and incredibly articulate. And when they tell jokes, I don't think anybody is looking down on them or what they're saying. So I do think we have to push the envelope. But it is ignorant not to realize that that communication is hugely impacted by context and culture. And we need to be sensitive to it. And that's why we need to be thoughtful, and we need to try things out in focus group, our ideas, to get real opinions from people.
And those who say we've become maybe overly sensitive, cancel culture, all that seems to be afflicting us?
Certainly, the pendulum might have swung a little farther than I would like to see it, but we do have to be aware and sensitive, and then make a conscious choice. At the end of the day, all of my coaching and teaching and podcasting is really to take habits and help people turn them into choices. So when it comes to your communication, don't just communicate in a certain way because that's what you've always done. Make a conscious choice. And if you want to say something that might be seen as challenging or threatening to the status quo, make that choice consciously, knowing there might be consequences of it.
Well, like I've said, you help a lot of people. You continue to help a lot of people, and my hat goes off to you. I want to, before we say goodbye, thanks to all who joined us for this live episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, which you can listen to live every Friday, 11 a.m. Pacific time, or on Apple, Spotify, or on our website at graymatter.show. And if you haven't yet become a member of this podcast, encourage you to join, going to our website at graymatter.show, where you can find previous episodes of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And again, that's Gray with an E. Also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you might have to me directly, mkrasny at graymatter.show. And thank our team, Gray Matter with Michael Krasny team of Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Colin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. And special thanks to this week's guest, Matt Abrahams. So pleased to have had you with us. Keep on keeping on.
Thank you so much.
And I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.